There he is. The process is you're welcome to leave your blanket. We'll all get cold at the end of the day while we're still here, so... No trouble. Do you want me to take the photo? Okay, come around. Send it around here. Right, sorry to take your wind out of your sails there, Chief Executive and Group Chief Financial Officer, but the entertainment's over. We're going back to the boring stuff.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Good morning, councillors. There are a few subjects I wanted to cover this morning. I want to cover an update on recent changes on the government's reform agenda. I want to provide an update on our savings target for this current financial year that we're in, and I want to speak to our response to the January 27 weather event and the review. Firstly, on the government reform agenda, specifically a few points in relation to the affordable water announcement that was made a few weeks ago. On the 13th of April, in fact, the Minister for Local Government and the Prime Minister outlined the proposed changes to the Three Waters program reset, now known as affordable water. The government announcement included a few key points that there will now be 10 new regionally owned and led public water entities to be established instead of the 4 as originally proposed. They maintain that balance sheet separation is still seen as critical to manage current and future infrastructure debt. Entities will be owned by local councils on behalf of the public, and entity borders to be based on existing regional areas as much as possible. Each entity to be run by a professional board with members appointed on competency and skill, and strategic oversight and direction to be provided by local representative groups, with each local council in the country to be represented. Importantly, the announcement also made clear that the better off funding that was expected to be paid to councils will no longer be made available. The impact of that for Auckland Council is in the order of $350 million. There's no change to the structure of Entity A, which will still include Auckland and Northland Water Services. We understand it's likely the Entity A Chief Executive role will remain unchanged. The Minister will be progressing the relevant legislation, aiming to have it passed before the general election in October. Generally, the announcement also made provision for a delay to the implementation timeline to commence from early 2025, although there is flexibility for it still to commence in the case of Auckland from July 2024, and that's a conversation that we need to maintain with the National Transition Unit and government. Our staff are working closely with the NTU to understand what that means for Auckland. The governing body has a workshop planned on the 10th of May to provide further updates. IMSB and local board chairs have been invited to that workshop. I'd like to make a few comments in relation to the savings target for the FY23 year, that is the year that we are in. And councillors might recall that we had a savings target for FY23 of $90 million. As at the end of March, we've achieved savings of $95.7 million. Permanent cost reductions have been achieved through a range of different activities and actions, operational efficiencies like fleet reduction and optimisation of our vehicle fleet. Office space reduction continues to be a focus, procurement savings through contract negotiations, service delivery improvements like digitisation of services continues to be an area of focus, and notwithstanding increased demand, there has been no growth in support services like HR, finance or governance. Our statutory FTE is reducing, and at the end of March was 6,338. And if we remove from that the externally funded roles, council funded roles sit at 6,253 FTE. The annualised turnover rate remains steady at 15%. The remainder of the savings are one-off savings, including underspend through spend controls, detailed budget reviews across customer and community services and various other cost categories. A range of savings through underspend, primarily from staff costs and professional services as a result of recruiting and spending controls in the Chief Planning Office, governance and group services, and a couple of $1 million of one-off savings from underspend in the Mayor's office and the CE's office. While overall the achievement of our savings target is a good result, it's important to note that a significant proportion of it is recurring. It's not all recurring savings. And a proportion of it, around 15%, are one-off savings in nature. Good in this financial year, but not beneficial in subsequent financial years. However, pleasing that we've achieved the cost savings target for this year. Thirdly, I want to make some comments in relation to the January 27 weather event, the cyclone, our flood response in particular, our response to the flood review in particular. On the 12th of April, Mike Bush presented the independent Auckland Flood Response Review. It was commissioned by the Office of the Mayor. Over the following days, I've reviewed the detail of that report and the Mayor's letter to me and took the time to reflect deeply on the contents and its recommendations. On the following Monday and Tuesday, Phil Wilson, in his capacity as Acting Group Recovery Manager, and I met with a wide range of media outlets to answer questions and share with them and therefore with Aucklanders our next steps. It's important to reassure Aucklanders and our agency partners that we take the report very seriously and to be upfront about areas where Aucklanders should expect more from us. Yesterday, the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Committee considered a prioritised plan of actions for the Auckland Emergency Management Function. The plan was received and is now will now move into implementation. The report has been referred through to the governing body and is on the agenda for today. Just to reassure you, we remain committed to addressing the areas identified in the review. From the perspective of the recovery more broadly, yesterday the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Committee we had the opportunity to introduce Matt Tucker, a newly appointed Group Recovery Manager who started with us yesterday. Matt will report directly to me. He will work across the organisation with the CCOCEs, our Recovery Office team, agency partners and elected members to deliver on our recovery objectives. We will provide monthly progress reports to the governing body, and from the May governing body report, you will also be provided with performance reporting and measures that outline progress against those objectives. We welcome Matt to the role. We're pleased to have secured someone of his experience and skills, and he's joining us in the meeting today. I'll hand over to Peter for an update on the group financials.
Thank you, Jim, and through you, Chair. What I will talk to today are the provisional results for the Auckland Council and Auckland Council Group to 31 March 2023, which will be finalised as part of quarterly reporting. So I'll start with the group, the results for the Auckland Council Group for the 9 months to 31 March. Capital investment, 1.87 billion against a budget of 2 billion. So that's a delivery of 93% of budget. There are some highlights in there, so I don't just talk numbers at you. Healthy Waters completed the Ports of Auckland, outfall upgrade tunnelling and clinker place in New Lynn. The cycling program at Lambie Drive site and corridor safety program at Atkinson Avenue were completed. The North West Bus Improvements Program, Te Ātatu South and North Main Works have had practical completion issued as well. The North West Bus Improvements Program, Te Ātatu South and North have had practical completion issued. The upgrade at the Pukekohe wastewater treatment plant was completed, which doubles its capacity and improves water quality in the Parker Lane stream, obviously topical issues at the moment. With respect to revenue, direct revenue was practically on budget. It was 2 billion against a budget of 1.9 billion. There, as usual, were several overs and unders, continuing the trend of previous months, the largest of those being 50 million under revenue on public transport, parking and infringement revenue, 30 million under on water care, interconnect growth charges and new connections revenue, and the upsides coming through water and wastewater user charges, 30 million on port storage and demurrage, 14 million AT Whakakatahi operating subsidy. That's a bit of a double count because that's also covering off some of the shortfall in the PT, and 14 million upside for Te Taki Auckland Unlimited fees around unexpected project activate revenues. So broadly on track. Direct operating expenditure, 2.557 million against a budget of 2.549 million. So that's in line with budget. And the key drivers in that, it's mainly due to a $14 million underspend on employee benefits through vacancies and recruitment control, and 23 million increase on outsourced works and service costs, which is mainly due to the weather events. Net debt, the other key aspect to talk to at the group level, a year-to-date increase of 760 million, which leaves net debt at 11.8 billion as at the end of March. Also within the group space, insurance placement meetings have begun for the placement of the group insurance, and the Ports of Auckland Treasury and insurance functions are now being provided on a group basis from Council Parent. If we come down to Auckland Council, the results for Auckland Council for the same 9-month period, capital expenditure of 300 million, that's a 78% delivery against a budget of 384 million, an underspend of 84 million, mainly driven by construction and land purchase delays. Direct revenue slightly above at 426 million against a budget of 423, so effectively online. And direct operating expenditure, 1.1 billion against a budget of 1.15 billion, 44 million below budget. The savings have been achieved, as our CEO described, with work remaining, as he also indicated, to achieve ongoing savings or reductions in OPEX. We have the annual budget process underway. The public consultation, as we know, closed on March 28th, and workshops have started and will continue. If I briefly turn to key economic market activity and updates, we've had some New information, annual inflation rate, consumer price index, the CPI, was 6.7% at the end of March 2023. Our chief economist, Gary Blick, will describe more around the largest change in their tradables versus non-tradables. And while this sounds reasonably technical, I think it's quite important that we unpick the key drivers behind that CPI result. It has implications for us. The official cash rate increased to 5.25% on April the 5th from 4.75%. Employment rate, 3.4% to the end of December, and GDP, gross domestic product, quarterly growth at the end of the March was 2.2%. So thank you for your attention. I'll now pass you over to Gary Blick to update some of those other key economic factors.
Kia ora koutou. Just offer some broad points on the matter of inflation and the outlook for interest rates, as Peter mentioned just now. Well, the headline figure does look like positive news in that we've seen consumer price index fall for the year to March 2023 from 7.2 to 6.7. But just it's useful to distinguish between that headline result and the underlying mix of price pressures. And one way that can be done is to separate out the, I guess, tradable versus non-tradable components. And that's just a way of saying there are parts of the economy that are quite exposed to international competition, and there's some that aren't exposed to international competition. And if we think about that reduction, most of that's come through the international channel, through the tradable or internationally tradable components, which the inflation's come down quite strongly there. But on the domestic side, the tradable component, or I should say the non-tradable component, it's actually increased from 6.6 to 6.8, which is an all-time high. So that's just a way of saying that, I guess, pressures on the domestic side of the economy are at an all-time high. And if you look beneath that headline figure, you get a different story, which is really that there's a risk of high inflation expectations becoming embedded in domestic wage and price setting behaviours. So that probably points to the Reserve Bank holding a firm line with the outlook for the official cash rate. And the consensus really is that a further increase of 25 basis points from 5.25 to 5.5% is very much on the cards for the next decision, which is scheduled for the 24th of May. Of course, the Reserve Bank's got a mandate to reduce inflation and keep it on average over time within its policy target band, which is 1 to 3%. Of course, right now the headline is sitting at 6.7, so there's some way to go there. That channel, of course, trying to raise the official cash rate, which flows through to commercial interest rates as a way of dampening activity by raising the cost of finance, so that households will ease back on consumption and businesses will also respond accordingly. I would say that the outlook from the Reserve Bank's monetary policy statement, which was released in February, is for an easing of inflationary pressures later this year, but the uncertainty is around how quickly that can be brought about. The Reserve Bank's forecast is for above 5% still by the end of the year, which is still high and above its policy target band. I'd just like to touch on, finally, on the implications of this outlook, I guess, for the Auckland Council and for households. One dimension to think about is that with the easing of house prices, we've seen the median price come back from a peak of 1.3 down to 1, probably unsustainable at that earlier peak, and some further falls yet, although we're still above the pre-COVID price. But what I would say about that is that with falling prices, that's a signal for an easing in development activity. So we would expect through that channel some of the consent volumes and the revenue that's being budgeted to fall that would come to pass in terms of implications for the council. I think from a household perspective, the cost of living pressures will still be there, albeit increasing at a slower pace. Just to put some of the pressures to date into perspective, we look below that headline rate, which was 6.7 for consumer price index. Unpick that and look at food. One of the essentials for households is up by 11%, and in particular fruit and vegetables year on year up 20%. Of course, some of that will reflect the impact on fresh produce from the severe weather events in the first quarter of this year too. I'd say that while these falling house prices are paper losses, households will adjust their activity with that reduced wealth that they would feel. Alongside that, some households will have income growth, with benefits in New Zealand Super being adjusted by CPI on the 1st of April is in line with government policy. And the outlook for the labour cost index is still for rising wages overall. So thank you.
Thank you for that bleak assessment of the economy. A couple of things I'd like to have you to keep an eye on and report to us is we often hear the word consents about building, but there is a big difference between a resource consent and a building consent. And at times like this, you'll find that the building consent numbers will drop off quite quicker than the resource consents, which have some considerable time before they lapse. So could we have a regular eye kept on that, because it gives us a good idea of the implications on the organisation. The other thing is we've now had several months since the 270 million jumped to $295 million hole. I've got a sneaking suspicion that $295 million hole has got bigger, and I would like to have some information at some stage on that. And I know you probably don't know what it is, but I'd be surprised if you're not going to look at me and say it hasn't got bigger, because that's one of the things that tends to happen in bleak times. Perhaps Mr Gudsley might like to just comment on that at least one way or another.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. We are coming back with a budget refresh for you as part of the annual budget workshops. I believe that one's scheduled for the 10th of May, but I might not be completely crisp, but it's early in May. And yes, we are seeing some pressures out there. I talked about the insurance placement. Obviously, we've had the large weather event, and we think that will impact upon price and capacity. And that's why I mentioned that we're working through that placement process now. Also, the inflation and interest rates within the economy are still driving some increases in some of our input costs, such as utilities. We're pulling that all together now, and that will come through in that budget workshop as a budget refresh.
You are generally confirming that that is not positive news, it's likely to be negative news.
I continue to look for positive news. I'm struggling.
When will there be good news? That should be the statement from now on. Deputy Mayor Simpson wishes to speak, followed by former Mayor Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. Jim, thank you very much, and Peter and team. Jim, first of all, congratulations on exceeding the budget for savings. It's always a combination of one-offs and permanent, so you've done really, really well in that space. But my question is around your, in the agenda, the bullet points around the three waters now called affordable water. What's not in there is the fact that the government have cancelled their second tranche of funding. If we were to have got that second tranche of funding, is it true to say we wouldn't have the $295 million hole we've currently got, because we could have used that money? Is that correct?
No, I'm going to say no, that's not correct. We hadn't counted on that money in our forecast. It wouldn't have been paid to us until after the close of this financial year. In any event, we would have had to consider how it was applied. Given it would be funded probably by debt, we in all likelihood, in exchange for assets, we in all likelihood would have dealt with it as a capital payment. But I'm looking across the table at Peter to confirm or otherwise correct me.
Rather than the accounting technical definition, I think the main aspect is it's a one-off, and the operating gap is something that's got to be solved for on an ongoing basis. So while you'd never look a gift horse in the mouth, and the money would have been useful, it wouldn't have solved the ongoing operating gap.
Just like it didn't last time. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. My questions are to Mr Stabeck, and they relate, as part of your report on government reform updates, I'm curious to know from your personal perspective, what impact is the Council having in terms of the advocacy to central government on legislative reform?
It's a little hard to know how to answer that question in a quantifiable way, Councillor, as I'm sure you would expect. The reality, though, is we still remain very well connected to to DIA and the National Transition Unit. They do seek our input. We provide it. We'll continue to work with them, but in terms of the extent to which we have been, helpful in shaping the changes that they've made, I'd say marginal.
Thank you. Secondly, in speaking from your perspective as CEO, what are the significant risks that you see at a personal sense for the council at this time, over and above those that have been well articulated by Mr. Gudsell? But I would be interested in your observations.
I'm sorry, Councillor, can you clarify risks in terms of?
I think for the period that we're considering, in an organisational sense, are there any risks that you would highlight to us as governors sitting around the table? Other than everything, as the Mayor is suggesting,
Yeah.
But it would be interesting to know what are those specific things that, or are there any specific things that you should be drawing to our attention?
Look, I would simply say, Councillor, that everyone knows we're in a difficult period of trying to agree the parameters of next year's budget under significant pressure to solve what we've talked about as being the budget gap, and the fact that none of those solutions are easy for anyone to be able to adopt. And I think everyone in the organisation feels both their obligation to support our communities, to continue to provide services, at the same time knows that the organisation is under pressure to be as efficient as possible, and in some cases will be required to do less. And in that environment, of course, there's a sense or an air of uncertainty that comes with all of that. It's uncertainty for our organisation, it's uncertainty for our people, and to some extent it's uncertainty for communities until we arrive at decisions. And so in the context of uncertainty, we face risks of, people making different decisions about their career, about confidence that they might have in their employment, in their funding, in those sorts of things. I would simply say the best solution for that is to get through the budget process with clear decisions so that we can move forward next year, knowing that whatever package of decisions councillors land on will require compromises to be made across all of those dimensions. And our job then, of course, is to get on and implement those things and rebuild the confidence that people have, having worked through that period of uncertainty.
Thank you.
Good answer, thank you. Councillor Henderson and then Councillor Fooley.
Thank you. A question for Mr. Gudsell. How has the discretionary spending initiative been implemented, and do we have an indication on the amount of savings that we've made or expect to make?
Thank you, Councillor. I'll reframe the question if that's okay, but let me know if I still hit the flavour of it. There wasn't a discretionary expenditure initiative. There was a process by which council management understood the requirements of us to manage our expenditure more tightly, given the weather events, to appropriately help assist the cost that would arise from that. The way in which that worked was from the top down, in terms of looking to manage discretionary expenditure to the extent that we were able to characterise and define that. And we went back to some of the lessons from COVID and the emergency response time, where we were able to characterise some essential services and some aspects which could be paused for a while. So I think we can see in the aggregate the achievement of the cost reductions over the period. To the extent that they extend over the 90, that would suggest to me in a directional sense that the discretionary expenditure controls have had some impact, but we haven't explicitly gone through a process of identification of how much of that came from our own constraint on discretionary spend.
Sorry, just to follow up, Mr. Mayor. So we're planning on doing that work post-July, figuring out how much money we've saved?
And back through the Mayor, it would be a very difficult exercise to characterise spend or non-spend as being driven by that, and would require a lot of work and probably lead to spurious accuracy. So it wouldn't be something I'd be thinking would be worth spending money on.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Fully, please.
Kia ora, thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Jim, and the team for your update. I actually didn't think it was quite as bleak as all that, and I did hear quite a few positives in your updates. And so I would like to ask a question about one of those positive points, and that is around our revenue being slightly up above what was projected. So if you could just give us a little bit more detail, why, or what happened, why was it up, and what was the makeup, just so that we can have something positive to end that on. Kia ora.
Okay, I'm looking for the most positive revenue number now. Council parent, that will be an adequate, so we'll just look at the parent position. So we're 3 above in terms of our direct revenue, and that's mainly driven by our other direct revenue. Now, to drill down into that, it's increased rent, leisure centre and building consent revenue totalling 15 million. So that's the upside, that's mitigating some of the downsides, but I won't go into the downsides too much. I'll just talk to that 15 upside in rent, leisure centre, building consenting revenue. The key aspect that's really pleasing in there is the way in which community facilities and recreational revenue is coming back as the subscriber base is coming back and the customers.
Okay, there's no more questions. Thank you very much for... Oh, no, sorry, Councillor Darby.
Sorry, and a bit late out of the blocks again there, Mayor, twice in a row. Just on the plan change 78 delay, can I address that now? Is it appropriate now on that? That's part of the report. Just in terms of that, I know we're having a workshop on the 12th on that. I'm just sort of concerned about the timing of that and the implications of that delay, which we don't understand. I understand there's a notice, an amendment notice needs to be lodged or taken by the Minister, because I understand there's implications of that delay, particularly it has potential to delay our natural hazards plan change, and I notice the Minister is making some suggestions that we can undertake changes to design standards, but the National Policy Statement for Urban Development constrained us significantly in that area. So I'm just wondering about, is the Chief of Strategy here to address that? Because it is a question of timing.
She's just had to leave the room.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there she is. She came in the other side.
Oh, the other way. So I'm not sure whether, Megan, you got that.
Apologies, sorry, I was just shooting out. I didn't hear the question. Sorry, Councillor Darby.
So in the report, it mentions the Plan Change 78 delay or extension, actually, granted by the Minister in response to Councillor Dalton's letter. I was sort of thinking about that and thinking about, you know, we're going to have a workshop on the 12th, yes, but I'm just wondering, given that the Minister has to, I think he has to amend the notice for intensification, notice...
There is a Gazette notice that
Gazette
would just change that final time requirement. Yep.
Yep. So look, my question is around the implications that possibly we didn't understand at the time, particularly around the natural hazards plan change. And my reading is, but I'm open for your confirmation or otherwise, is that it actually delays the opportunity for us to introduce that plan change because you can't really go and amend the PC 78. You have to wait for it to go through, and then you apply a new plan change. And then the second one is the Minister made some statements about Council taking the opportunity to look at a whole lot of design standards, which I thought we were entirely constrained on by the National Policy Statement, Urban Development. So 2 areas there.
Through the Chair, thanks, and apologies for having to repeat that. We are confident that there are changes that we can make through the Plan Change 78 and the additional time that we've been given in order to both do the evidential work and then the variation effectively, which is what you're talking about, to the plan change. I think, however, we may find, depending on the conversation around this table, the kind of risk appetite that you may or may not have anymore, and some of these, the broader issues that we'll be working with you on in terms of the consequences of the flooding, is that there may well be additional, like an additional plan change or something that is out of scope, which, Councillor Darby, is your point. So I believe there is work we can do within the scope of Plan Change 78. Depending on the conversations, it might go wider than that. And I think that links to your second point. I agree with you, some of the things that the Minister is suggesting to us that are important, or to you as decision makers are important. I agree some of that is out of scope because it is so narrowly focused, and that has always been a concern to us.
Is it worth communicating that to the Minister, that some of his statements are actually constrained by his own legislation? Not to make him
I'm happy
wrong,
to,
but just to actually seek his support on how we can achieve the outcomes even he agrees with.
We've certainly been talking to ministry officials on that broader conversation about scope and how much we can actually do, we believe, within the scope of the Act versus what they think, whether that's minister or officials, we may be able to do. I think the question of going back to the minister is a political one, so I'm happy if the chair and deputy chair wants to take that up, happy to advise them on that, but that really is a political matter in my view.
Okay. And one last question, just on the water reforms, the scope to go early, and look, you can only challenge these things for so long, and then the law is the law. And Chief Executive, is there opportunity, if we should so choose, for us to agree that we've done our best to amend the bill and legislation as much as possible? We've won on a few counts and lost out on others. Is there the opportunity to actually implement the water reforms as of 1 July on our part, Entity A, 1 July 24?
Perhaps I might answer that because, in fact, you're quite prescient in both of those questions. Probably a little bit late with the first one. I had breakfast with David Parker this morning, so if I'd had a clear understanding of that, which I'm still struggling to get of this 78 ones, I'd have raised it, but I can raise it with him because I do see him regularly. And with regard to the early thing, that's in the mix of trades. We would be prepared to go early if we were prompted with sufficient funds to do so. And so I think you're right. If they're going to do it anyhow, and you can go early as a kind of like a Judas bull and get something for it, it might be worth looking into it. But I wouldn't do anything without coming back to everybody. But it's on the table of things in negotiation.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking of our next budget, our LTP, which is that's where we need to be factoring.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I've got to get over this
you.
first hurdle, but the next budget is the one which will carry on with the first hurdle cleared into a more sustainable way. And if they are going to do it, we may as well get the best we can. So I've got no problem at all with that question. Thank you. I believe that brings us to an end of this here. Before we move to the next one. I'll need a mover and a seconder to accept that. All those in favour of receiving those reports, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, received. I'm going to risk a 5-minute break there's been a constant stream of councillors going out somewhere or other, which is probably indicating there's a need for a 5-minute break.